actually, today my talk is going to be focused around issues of integration and diversity, which partly brings together arguments that I've made in various places over the last few years, which is a kind of a challenge to the notion of not just integration, but to the notion of diversity. And I have to say at the beginning, it's not that I'm opposed to people living together, being integrated or being cohesive. It's not that I'm opposed to diversity and heterogeneity, quite far from it. But what I'm critical about is the kind of discourses that have grown around these ideas of integration and diversity, which I think, and I've argued, are Janus-faced. On the one hand, there's an attempt to provide conditions where people can live together peacefully and live together equally, perhaps. But on the other hand, the way that the discourses and the practices are formulated actually means that that's not possible. So that we're getting two contradictory or paradoxical positions emerging around integration and diversity. So that's what my talk is about. And there are, Ursula mentioned this book that's just come out called Contesting Integration, Engendering Migration, which is a co-edited volume. And there's an earlier book that came out a few months before, which is called Paradoxes of Integration, Female Migrants in Europe, which again is on the issue of the problems of integration, particularly the way that migrant women experience it. And there's a third book that's going to come out in the next couple of months, which is more on work and integration, and the challenges that the way that sort of the labour market functions for migrants, the challenges that poses for the integration of people, including, of course, a very large section of people, which are women. Particularly, as Ursula has mentioned, I'm focusing a lot of my work on issues of gender as well as racialization and class. So, as you can see, beyond integration, my argument is going to be that integration and diversity discourses actually set up boundaries, the boundaries that they purport to want to dismantle. And they're premised, I think, particularly on a boundary between us and them. So that's one of the main arguments of the paper. And where difference is constructed in the arguments, is constructed as dangerous and constructed as deficient, so that those people who are hailed as different are also hailed as dangerous and deficient, different categories of them at different times. There is also too much focus on culture and not enough on material structures of inequality, as though people can be integrated if they learn a language, or if they learn how to cook the way the majority cook, as though things to do with cultural aspects can solve problems of people being incorporated in society in an equal and just way. And one of the things that I've done in a lot of my work is, of course, put forward a particular notion, a particular development of a notion of intersectionality, of the importance of paying attention to different modes of difference, different modes of inequality constructed around, for example, gender, racialization, ethnicity, class, disability, and so on. In my own work, I've generally focused particularly on gender, race, and class, but there's no reason why other modes of inequality and difference can't be incorporated into the framework. So, moving on to integration and some central issues. One of the primary problems with a lot of policies on integration, both national and European policies, is that they take the nation state as the unit of reference. So they think of people being integrated into a particular nation state, and this is rather odd when we live in such a transnational and global world, where migrants, for example, who are the subject of integration policies usually, are themselves transnational actors. They're not fixed in one space. We know that, there are trans migrants, people who migrate, from one country to another country looking for, better conditions, that there's circular migration, there's transitory migration, so that, people live their lives in a range of different national and transnational contexts. So when integration policies, for example in Britain, are dedicated to people being integrated into British society, whatever that might mean, what is those policies are ignoring is that we live in a world which is much more cosmopolitan, which is much more transnational. And if we're interested in people being integrated, again, whatever that means, and we'll come to look at it in a minute, we should be looking at the world much more than just a nation state. Secondly, another issue with integration more broadly is that there's very little coherence in policies on integration. Because if integration really is the goal, again, whatever that might mean, i.e. incorporating migrants or the others fully into society, then securitization discourses and migration controls would be changed, would actually be, would not exist in the way that they do, because I believe that migration controls, which are often racialized, which make boundaries between those who are deemed acceptable and therefore should be allowed entry, and those who are deemed undesirable or dangerous and are excluded from entry, that process would be completely undermined by a real concern with integration. How can one actually deliver integration policies properly when one has a range of controls which actually demonize certain sections of the population? Not only function to exclude some from coming in, but actually those who have come in become demonized, become regarded as others, become dangerous, become racialized. And that is the problem with the coherence of policies. A true concern with integration, in my view, would not have the kind of migration controls and secularization discourse that exists today. And the third problem, more general problem with integration, is the problem of constructing society as itself homogeneous. In other words, the migrants are the other, but everyone else is homogeneous, which is absolute nonsense because we live in a very differentiated, heterogeneous world. Not only are there differences of gender, class, age, and so disability and so on, but there are all sorts of differences in society. Difference is everywhere. Diversity, if you like, is everywhere. It's not as though this is a homogeneous society and, people just don't fit into a homogeneous set of values. And there is attached the problem of assimilationism, that the expectation that migrants, the other, have to assimilate into these supposed homogeneous set of values, which actually don't exist. So moving on a little bit, the construction of us and them, which is found in these discourses. Well, society itself is differentiated. I've mentioned this already. George Herbert Mead noted society is unity in diversity, he tells us. The very basis of all society is diversity. And diversity itself, the concept of diversity, is not a neutral concept. It's not something that we can just, talk about as though it doesn't have a political inflection. Diversity itself is used in particular ways. It's used in particularly political ways. So when we use it, we have to be very careful about how we use the term, that the political inflection that we give to it does not construct the diverse, supposed diverse, as the other, construct the diverse, as though the rest are not diverse. And one of the other things that relates to this is, who is that figure who needs to be integrated? How is that figure constructed? What is it about them that makes us say we want to integrate them? And we have to be careful also, what do we want that figure to be integrated into? What is the construction of the society within which it is to be integrated? So there's the question of the figure to be integrated and the society to which that figure needs to be integrated. If the society is constructed as a homogeneous society, for example, then it constructs it as pretty much impossible to integrate someone who doesn't fit in, who hasn't assimilated. And if the figure is a dangerous figure or a deviant figure, then there are all sorts of problems about thinking of how they can be integrated. How do we make that figure less dangerous, less deviant, or indeed less deficient, if that's how they're constructed? So that there are all these questions then about how we construct the premises, the very premises of integration policies. And one of the phrases that I think captures the problem with the notion of diversity as it's often used is the idea of the perverse diverse. There are those diverse who are actually okay, and they're usually ones that are not too different or don't challenge the values of Western modernity too much. And then there's the other diverse, who are the perverse, who are those either who can't integrate or don't want to integrate, they're incapable of integrating. So they're the perverse, and they're usually regarded as either dangerous or the tropes that we find, the different tropes of danger, of deviance, of deficiency, and of disgust towards particular kinds of others. And different others would come under this category in different ways. Of course, in contemporary Western societies, often the figure that most represents danger, deviance, and disgust, all those three things, is the Muslim, the Islamic figure who represents the danger to the world that we live in. And we can come to the question of diversity a little bit more. And one of the things that Zimmel, very famous classical sociologist, pointed out was that once you talk about the other side, the difference, you're already constructing a bridge of difference. So that when diversity is mentioned, already we must have ideas in our head about what the categories of difference are, what the gaps are, or what the rivers are where we need to build the bridges. We already construct sides or categories. So this is something endemic to the notion of diversity. It's something in a way that we can't avoid, because in human societies we work with categories. We can say the category of gender. The category of gender already constructs difference, and it constructs different groupings of people. And then if you're going to talk about equality, or like integration, then you have to think about a bridge of somewhere to link different bits of the gender category. And that's the quandary. And can we dispense with the categories, though? I don't think we can, because the human brain and society do work with categories. The question, though, then must be, how do we talk about categories without providing a way which fixes those categories, which essentializes those categories? How do we make our categories more fluid? And one of the problems, I think, with diversity is very often is that it fixes the categories. It fixes those who are diverse and who need to be integrated. Because if George Herbert Mead is right, and I believe he is, that diversity is everywhere, then it's not a question of fixing the categories of difference. It's recognising that there's a situational facet that needs to be taken into account. It's not that the categories themselves are fixed in space, but that they come together at different times in different spaces. That, you know, being a woman, for example, is not a fixed category. It manifests itself differently in different spaces. Sometimes it becomes irrelevant, an irrelevant category for some purposes. At other times it becomes a primary category, both in terms of experience and in terms of structures. So that the categories themselves need to be rethought away from the idea of fixity. Now, coming to integration now, integration, as you may have already gathered from what I've said so far, is itself a very ideological notion. And it assumes integration into a given social fabric. The fabric is fixed, you must integrate into this. That's the idea. There's no notion, despite, you know, a lot of talk in the documents, that, you know, some of the relevant documents in the UK, for example, there's no concern with changing the fabric, with actually bringing the richness of the others into the fabric and transforming the fabric, or rewriting, you know, the status quo. The status quo is there, people need to fit into it. And one of the other things is that everybody else is seen as not having a problem with integration. So those who need to be integrated are seen as the migrants. Despite the fact that in sociology, for example, there's a long history of the notion of social integration as something much broader, much more to do with the structures of society and people in general. Whereas in contemporary discourse of integration, it's always the other who needs to be integrated. Everybody else is okay, you know, they're perfectly fine. And one of the you know, things that a lot of people think of as perhaps racist, people who might vote for UKIP or people who vote for the National Front, those people often are people who feel that there's no one trying to get them to integrate. There's nothing about them. And, you know, I'm not saying that they're right, you know, in the way that they blame the migrant, far from it, but rather they have a sense that they've disappeared from the map. You know, nobody is concerned with them. And the problem with integration is indeed that, you know, integration focuses on the other. But what about people in general? You know, unemployed, youth, and so on, more generally. And integration also has tend to focus on culture. I mentioned this before, on culture. So a lot of the policies on integration have been concerned with providing language facilities so that people, foreigners, can learn the language or can learn about life in the UK. There's a Life in the UK test, for example, where, you know, a lot of people wouldn't be able to to answer some of those questions who've lived in England all their life, let alone migrants. So there's a kind of elision between being integrated civically and actually sort of being able to speak the language and belonging to a community. And I think to think of modern societies as communities where people share values is ridiculous, because modern society is highly fragmented and differentiated. And this is something that has to be acknowledged, not go backwards to some notion of constructing a community where we all have shared values, but coexisting in a world where there are different values. where, you know, we can inhabit a universe where we don't have to be the same in order to live together and work together. That's what I believe is a much more proper goal. So I'm going to skip some things because of time. Now, I mentioned before the whole problem of culture and culturalization, the importance given to culture, but the lack of importance given to structural changes, to structural inequalities. And the notion of culture that is used can be referred to as a museumized and rucksack view of culture. So the other, the migrant, has a culture, is seen as having a culture which they bring with them, like a kind of rucksack, like a baggage. And then they're placed in this place where there is culture, which is again a culture that other people have, which is something they possess. And then the problem becomes, well, how do we make this person's, get rid of this rucksack and adopt another baggage, which is the same as everybody else's? So culture becomes a thing rather than a mode of interpreting and understanding the world, rather than a process, rather than a processual element of social life. And in order for people, if the intention is for people to be cohesive and to feel they belong to the social fabric, it seems to me to be antithetical to that spirit to say to those people, get rid of, we don't want you to speak your language so much, we want you to adopt our values and our culture. Acknowledging and giving recognition to the validity of what they have, what they bring, and their way of operating the world must be the only way, it seems to me, to confront the issue of coexistence amongst people who've lived in different countries and have different values and different ways of life. It can't be to say to them, no, you know, you have to adopt ours. I'm also thinking that it's counterproductive in other ways, because a lot of the people who are deemed to need to have their deficit because they only speak Bengali or they only speak Italian or Spanish, or they don't speak English well enough to demand of them to speak English, when there are so many women from these groupings that actually will find it very difficult, well nigh impossible, you know, given not only the lack of opportunities, proper opportunities. Of course they can go to classes, but they may have small children, or they may live in very patriarchal cultural environments, or they may just be too busy to do it. I'm thinking, for example, of my own mother. I mean, I'm a migrant from Cyprus. My mother came to this country and couldn't speak English. And much to her shame, actually, she never really learned English very well. She could just about speak English to go shopping and that sort of thing. And for her to be targeted, I mean, she's been dead now over 10 years, but to be targeted and to be told, you know, in order to be able to, you know, function, to be a citizen, you know, you have to learn English, and to demand of her to go into classes, it would have been very difficult for her. Although I think she would have wanted it, that's the other thing, because when she first came over to Britain and she had some small children, including myself, she said to my father, she said to him, I'd like to go and learn English. And he said to her, who will look after the children? Anastasia, which was her name. So, I mean, there's where kind of gender and, although my father was a communist, and a feminist, nonetheless, when it came to his own role, you know, the children have to be looked after, and you are the one who will look after the children, so you can't possibly go. So there are some problems here. I'm not arguing that people shouldn't have access to learning the language. I think it is important for people to live in a society where they do understand the language, but to demand it of people and to exclude them on the basis that they haven't been able to, is a different question altogether. It's facilitating, finding ways of facilitating people's engagement with the society that they live in. Rethinking the society so the society's constructed is much more multicultural and inclusive. And now I just want to focus on these three terms, belonging, culture and identity, because they often come in when we're talking about the integration of migrants and the diversity of migrants. And they're terms that, you know, sometimes are used as though they're the same, like, for example, what makes my identity as a Cypriot? People will say to me, you have an identity as a Cypriot because you know the culture, because you know you were brought up in that culture. That's what makes you a Cypriot. But actually, you know, the fact that you were brought up in a culture and you understand the culture doesn't necessarily mean you identify with the culture. There are lots of things about, you know, the patriarchal values, for example, when I was being brought up, that I would completely reject. And I would reject a particular formulation of being a Cypriot, which, you know, has that as a central element. So you don't necessarily, just because you know the culture, and somebody can turn around and say to you, well, you are a Cypriot, you can be hailed as a Cypriot, doesn't mean that you have an identity. So, you know, knowing the culture doesn't bring identity. So asking people to learn English, and asking them to know about the history of England or Britain doesn't mean that they will automatically change their identity. They might learn these things very instrumentally, and still they might politically reject some of the values of the British state. You know, it's a strange thing to believe, for the state to believe that, you know, as long as people can learn the language and know about life in the UK, they will suddenly think, great, you know, fantastic society. And I reject everything else that I know. You know, this is the one I belong to. So, and the other thing is that belonging to a place is about experiences of being part of something, about being included. You know, how can you make someone feel they belong to, say, Britain or Ireland, for that matter, you know, if you're saying to them, you know, actually, you know, we don't really like the way you live your life, we want you to live like us. You know, if you don't actually include people and give them a say and validate their own experiences, their own life, they're not going to feel they belong. So it's terribly, in my view, counterproductive. Because belonging, as I say in the last bullet point, involves access and opportunities, citizenship practices and entitlements. So that's what needs to be done, and that is much more a structural issue of inclusion than just asking people to kind of learn language and life in the UK. So, sticking to belongings are complex. You know, Norman Tebbit talked about, if you remember, the cricket test. You know, who is it that you're going to cheer for? Is it, you know, but actually you can cheer for different, you know, sides at different times. You might think that's wrong, you know, and of course some people might cheer for Arsenal, you know, always. And that's one of the problems with football crowds, of course, is this strong tribal element to it. But our belongings, you know, are fluid and complex and situational. And we need to recognise this with migrants as well, that their belonging also can shift and change in different circumstances. And it has different forms. You know, belonging involves being able to belong to an organisational way, to be included in work, in school, in political spheres, being accepted by others, not being racialised, being given recognition, being greeted on the street rather than being avoided. It's interesting talking about avoidance, because we think of it, you know, well, in the integration discourse as something to do with migrants. But I was reading something about Woodbury Down Estate, which is a council estate in London where I grew up actually, and now this estate is being redeveloped, supposed regeneration. There was an article in The Observer about this a few weeks ago. It's being regenerated and they're building these mixed housing things, and all the people that were on Woodbury Down Estate are now, or some of them are being rehoused in this mixed housing. And what the people interviewed were saying was that those people who bought their flats privately, and these flats in Finsbury Park are going for up to £1 million. That's what people are paying privately for some of them. And the people who have bought into the flats cross the road and avoid the ex-council tenants. So here we have, suppose, mixed housing, but there's a lot of social avoidance that's going on there. And it's a social avoidance that, you know, migrants particularly, but particularly racialised migrants, face a lot. But it's not just them. Women experience a lot of avoidance too. You know, there was a recent research project that showed that men, for example, interrupt women much more than they interrupt other men. So that, again, that's a form of avoidance, the interruption. I don't want to hear, I want to avoid what you're having to say to me. So these function in an intersectional way. It's, you know, it's not fixed categories. It's who is the woman, where is she placed, what is her role, what is her class, you know, and what is her position in terms of racialization or ethnicity as well. It's not just being a woman that produces this, but where you're placed as a woman or as, you know, a racialized person. So I think that given that integration discourses and diversity discourses, what underpins them is some real genuine concern with extending belonging, with creating a better society where people can be included, and the problems and the way that it's formulated, the political underpinnings of the way it's formulated. How can we think of non-binary ways of belonging? How can we reframe the terms of reference of integration? And I think that the term solidarity, I find useful. You know, solidarity has its resonances in Marxist struggles and so on, which you know, enriches it too. But it's not just about class. We can have solidarity between people who are placed differently in terms of power, differently in terms of racialization and migration. Solidarity means, I think, accepting the difference, not wanting to change the difference, and forging solidary bonds with those who are different, and recognizing that you can hold hands with others. You don't have to make them the same. You know, and that, I think, is a very crucial element that needs to be incorporated in policies. You know, how do we bring about a society where the differences are there, but we can forge bonds and solidarity? And part of this, you know, is to move away from fixed notions of difference, recognizing that, you know, the solidarity we have also means that there are points of connection and sameness at the same time. We're not just different from the other, we're also the same as the other. And at different points, we are more same or less same. So that there isn't a binary, you know, we are the same with these people, but we are different to these people. On different grounds, we are the same and different. And there's what an intersectional sensitivity can alert us to. You know, what do we have in common, as well as what are the points that separate us, and how can we support each other in the process? And some of this is, you know, I've referred to translocation positionality, which is a concept I'm not going to talk about today, but which partly tries to capture this fluidity and the complexity of how we position ourselves and how others position us. So reframing integration beyond us and them, I mentioned solidarity. There's also another concept which is in a way the same, kind of similar to multiculturalism. I mean, multiculturalism has had a bad name. It's been critiqued from both the right and the left for different reasons. The right say that it creates, you know, sort of parallel communities and pockets of people living separate lives. The left says it doesn't go far enough, we should be anti-racist, not multiculturalist. But multiculturalism, not using it in a state multiculturalist way, but is in a multiculturality kind of way, is very similar to what has been referred to as interculturality, which is the need for people to talk together, to have conversations with one another, and how through conversation and through, you know, acknowledgement of the other, we can come to points of transformation and knowledge. So interculturality is another aspect, I think, that, you know, kind of provides a lead into this. And the third one is, of course, intersectionality, which is recognizing that, you know, migrants are also gendered, they're classed, they're raced, you know, they have other attributes as well. And they're people, they're individuals, and with all that complexity that individuals have. And therefore to treat them just as migrants, as the other, and to integrate them with that, doesn't work, because we have to think of, you know, how they're placed and how they place themselves in society in much more intersectional ways. So in terms of citizenship, and it's something this book partly tries to do, looking particularly at citizenship issues, I think active citizenship policies must involve better access for people to opportunities, facilitating participation, a growth in equality, and developing and fostering a sense of belonging. So, just to conclude, we need more joined-up policies, we need a much more greater emphasis on structures of inequality, we need to enable people, but we need to abandon, I think, the lens of integration and diversity as it is formulated today, because it is essentially Janus-based and it's counterproductive, reinforces the boundaries it itself sets out to undermine. Thank you very much for your attention.